Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first session of this CILE 6th International Conference. Welcome to you all. We start a little bit late. Our apologies for this, but we will try to catch up time as much as we can, inshallah. We will follow, so I have 4 speakers. The 4th will come soon. We will follow the order which you have in the conference booklet. So we will start with Dr. Of course, I'm very much honored to moderate the session in which I have these distinguished speakers. And I'm sure you will enjoy the talks and the discussions with them. We will follow the order we have in the booklet. So we will start with Dr. Bassem Al-Ra'i. Dr. Bassem Al-Ra'i received his PhD from the University of Münster in Germany. And he's currently a lecturer at the Lebanese University and other universities as well. His research interests are quite varied: political philosophy, philosophy of religion, and hermeneutics. He presented at many international conferences, and he has a long list of publications, including books like The 1943 Pact, The State and Society in Contemporary Debate, At the Frontiers of Knowledge, and also an introduction to philosophy, which is translated from German. He's also active in social debates concerning civil society and peaceful coexistence in diverse societies. I immediately give you the floor. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you.
Please.
أود بداية أن أشكر مركز دراسات.
I would like to thank CILE for this invitation and the boldness of floating this idea, religion and the public sphere. I would like also to salute the youth who are participating with us, and indeed I would like to be brief. You can consult my research paper and you can get it from the organizers. When it comes to the public sphere, in accordance with the transformation of this concept and the alignment thereby of the recovery of religion, indeed is peculiar. And we'd like to ask what facilitated the new coming of religion when the public sphere was detached from religion. Here I'm talking about the Western, philosophy. The response or the answer was to do with the alignment with the two, and then the expansion of the concept of the public sphere, and then the concept of the return of religion. When it comes to religion and the public sphere, this research was part and parcel of monolithical monotheisms. As a matter of fact, these religions did not represent a challenge to the public sphere because it conformed with the public sphere. As a matter of fact, Hegel used to understand the issue as follows. Ethos, or the Greek spirit, indeed met religion, and religion was a vital component. It was practical in his eyes. And this conformity between religion and the reality does not apply to monotheisms, because these religions differentiate nature from revelation, because revelation is far away from the control of humans, and thus there are no conformity or compatibility between religion and the public sphere, whereby the public sphere is intrinsically coherent. So the issue is to do with the results of the monothetic kind of religions that do relate to the relationship with the authority. And the question that has been surfaced with modernity: how could we deal with religion as an existing reality that is undeniable with obstructing its authority-related effectiveness? And this took place as follows. First, the monotheistic element of religion has been transformed in accordance with Kant and other philosophers. The other issue is as follows. Religion can be accommodated through the public sphere, through law, and then it can be obstructed and can be individualistic because the state cannot deny the freedom of conscience and the freedom of creed that is entrenched in the laws. Thirdly, religion contradicted with the science-related facts because it used to be superstitious or mythical rather than being realistic. Dealing with such a religion lies in the fact that religion is detached from the public sphere, and this has been indeed witnessed in secularism, whereby secularism generalized the three steps that I've talked about, whereby religion can be exclusively detached from the public sphere. Hans Joos tried to have in place a full-fledged study that relates to the full-fledged secularism, and he is German, and as a matter of fact, he said that secularism had no upper hand when it comes to religion. And he posed a question: would it be possible for modernity to lead to secularism inevitably? And he answered this question and said in his thesis, a number of theses that I would like to summarize as follows. Non-believers think that they supersede the historicity of humanity, and thus they would like to think that religion will dissipate inevitably. Secularism might mean to detach or dissociate religion from the public sphere, as they say. And thirdly, there is a belief that modernity means economic growth and development. That means that it will supersede everything in the past, and thus it will have a direct influence in weakening the religion itself or obliterating it. And these three elements were attached to the following. If they are there, then there would be no religion. The first element is epistemological. That means the religion or based knowledge is not up to the standards, and thus the science-related knowledge will be better. And second, if religion was supplanting a lack of insecurity that is existential, then if we boost welfare and political participation and providing a good lifestyle for the populace, this will lead to the denial of the necessity for religion itself. And if we have civilizations that are coherent, and if we resort to the authoritarianism regimes and the propensity of religiosity, then individualism as well as democracy will make the religion even more feeble. So it's said that secularism deals with the ideology of the victorious rather than understanding the reality as it is. The stance of viewers is intrinsically related to the surfacing of the public sphere. If we look at the historicity of the public sphere, we see, especially in the West, that religion was behind a number of formats of the development of the public sphere. And the public sphere was not the same in the past and doesn't apply to all the countries on a par with each other. And indeed, the public sphere is a sphere that is different than the private one, and it is different from the authority itself, and it is an open space for everyone. And thus, there is an isolation or a difference between religion and the public sphere. However, this concept has been developing and it has become an isolated kind of concept away from individualism and public sphere, or private sphere rather. And that means when we use the public here, the word public, it ought to be attached to freedom, and the freedom ought to be there in a sphere whereby the freedom can reflect itself. And then tackling the issue of freedom was more organized, indeed, in the principle of democracy. Jürgen Habermas, in his book, The Transformation of the Public Sphere, acted on crystallizing such concept in 3 eras. The first one, the dissociation between the public, that means the authority, and the public sphere for everyone that is not monopolized by the authority, as well as the authority at that time. Here we're talking about the 16th century, the 17th and the 18th. The authority used to be represented by the church, the fiefdoms, and the aristocracy, whereby the public sphere was monopolized by them. And at that stage, people wanted to make religion individualistic, as well as the preservation of the freedom of religion. And this has been coincided with individualism and aristocracy, businessmen, professionals, intellectuals who dug their heels in contrast to the authority. The second era is the public sphere and breaking the stereotypes that are traditional and supplanting them with what Kant has called upon, i.e. the generic usage of the mind or the intellect. So everybody has become an intellect, everybody has become a partner through exchanging insights, and this transformation has pushed the public discussions to see light, and indeed emphasized also the power of the argument. And this had led to what we used to call the absolute under the microscope of criticism, and thus the term of references that monopolized this issue, i.e. the religious and the civil authorities, they will lose their term of reference, and the winner would become the art and the humanities and the individual. And this indeed has been related to humanism. Humanism is based on the equality between the populace and to have a social contract in place, as well as to have a legal framework that is based on a number of abstract criteria that deal with humans as being individuals in essence. The third era is the liberal-related era, whereby the legal framework is entrenched and the liberal concept provides opportunities for everyone to seek whatever they want to have, providing that they won't hurt the other human fellows. And thus, we needed to have a legal framework that is based on just and equality. This atmosphere of liberalism had led to relativism, i.e. the truth and the relation thereby with the beneficial that does not contradict the interest of humans, and this had affected the religion as being an obstacle of the freedoms, because it deals with the relative reality with absolutism without giving evidence. However, when it comes to marginalizing religion, and this is the third part of my intervention, the recovery of religion. Indeed, secularism was not conclusive in dissociating the public sphere with religion, because the crisis that the mind incurred, i.e. the Enlightenment period and thereafter, Max Horkheimer and Adolf Adorno in their book The Debatism of Secularism has opened the door for the relativity of the mind itself. At the time of the Enlightenment, they used to say that mind will lead to liberty and will lead to happiness. However, this wasn't the case because humanity delved into practicing or exercising atrocities, dictatorships, despotism, absolutism in the authority, and wars that were unspeakable indeed. The market had the upper hand over humans under the pretext of welfare, and indeed 2008 crisis, the economic crisis surfaced in 2008. These kind of crises had led to post-modern era or the post-secularism, and this era led to the fact that we need to ponder over the mind itself, and indeed the mind that depends on justifications and means would fail. So looking through resources again would make us go back to civilizations and thus religion. So that's why people talk today about the recovery of religion, and as a matter of fact, I would like to provide you with 3 examples in this regard that illustrates the fact that the role of religion might be indeed indispensable. Charles Taylor is a philosopher and a sociologist who is a Canadian. The other one is for Jürgen Habermas, and he is also a sociologist and a German philosopher. And when he talked about the religion and the relationship thereby with the collective mind, and then Carl Wilber, and he is an American scientist, he talked about religion and the holistic view of the human existence. Charles Taylor maintains that we are delving into neo-Dorkism, and he indeed defines that by the interaction between the collective and the private, and indeed seeking the shore of tranquility might relate to religion itself. That means religion has played an effective role in the formation of the collective and private identities, as well as affecting the society at large. And Taylor emphasized the fact that there is a civilized kind of status of boredom that had emanated from the inappropriate individualism that dissociated humans from values and ethics, as well as just the mind that depends on justifications that is perilous, as well as the political dimension that is manifest in the industries and the technological kind of multinationals and their hegemony over the existence of humans or the destiny of them thereby. And thus, the recovery of the religion is a good thing in his opinion. And as a matter of fact, individualism has been dissipating slowly and has been, as a matter of fact, dissociated from what Tocqueville has talked about, i.e. the details of the absurd. So, because of this boredom, humans do feel depressed because there is no horizon of the meaning itself. So, religion provides the meaning for life, and thus it has a role to charge humans with energy to get to the meaning without claiming that it is an authority that is direct. However, it recovers a role that is pioneering on the front of having a meaning displayed or provided to humans. And Jürgen Habermas, and I would like to be brief here, Jürgen Habermas, his ideas emanate from the community itself. He says that religion is there very forcefully in the community, and a rational state cannot deny its existence. Thus, if the democratic states were based on the freedom of humans to use their own brains. So how could a state obliterate a mind that is religious? At the end of the day, how could this state say that this mind is obstructive and cannot bring you anything if it is religious? So this philosopher is saying that this is a contradiction in the democracy-related principles. If the brain is respected by secularism, it ought to be respected by the democracy if it was religious mind. And indeed, this would entail the following. The democratic secularist kind of mind cannot provide the absolute truth for us and cannot deny the religious mind its own freedom. And on the other hand, those who are religiously observant, if they need to have a role in the public sphere, they need to translate the religious lingua that talks about absolutism as well. They need to translate it. Here I'm talking about translation. We need to translate it into concepts that do conform with the society. And as the Sheikh said, we need to understand the morphing reality. Kam Wilber, and I would like to be brief as well to display his thesis. Wilber, his ideas emanated from a case study as well, or his society. Globalization left no door shut between the countries, and thus any knowledge cannot be monopolized by a certain nation because the knowledge is omnipresent, the knowledge is generic, and thus if we research here, we cannot have certain findings that do supersede certain other findings. No, we need to have an integrated vision that would incorporate the sub-visions of every single nation, because these sub-visions are there. Thus, Wilber talks about this issue, and when he talks about religion, when he talks about Maslow and Lovinger, Piaget, Grote, and others, these philosophers used to have the religion at the top of the pyramid when it comes to the conscience of humans and his or her knowledge. So how could I obliterate the role of the religion when it comes to the comprehensive way of looking at humans? And he says the emergence of such civilizations forcefully on the globe, we need to acknowledge the role of religion, because the religion plays a major role in our societies. And in conclusion, I would like to say, in accordance with Taylor, Habermas, and Wilber, if their ideas emphasize the fact that there is a distinguished role shouldered by religion, and indeed religion is part and parcel of the public sphere in accordance with these three people, and it is influential, and if it has no authority, we can say that secularism might represent a supporting factor to religion. Indeed, religion is a civilized leverage by itself, and this development provides us in the Arab world with a room to scrutinize our religion, especially when it comes to the public sphere, because our religion is intrinsically related to the public sphere, and that's why we need to study it extensively, away from being boastful about its authority, because the societal changes allude to the fact that there are certain secular related elements in our community. Thus, the issue has started in Europe, and it ought to start in our land. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We move immediately to Dr. Suhaira Siddiqui. Dr. Suhaira Siddiqui got her PhD in religious studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara. She taught at a number of universities, and she held fellowships at Cambridge University and Harvard before joining Georgetown University, where she's now assistant professor of theology. As for her publications, besides a series of articles, she published her monograph, Knowledge, Law, and Politics, an intellectual portrait of Al-Juwayni, one of the prominent religious scholars in the Islamic tradition. And her forthcoming publication will be a volume entitled Locating the Sharia, Legal Fluidity in Theory, History, and Practice. I give you the floor, and you have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Muhammad, and thank you for the kind invitation to come. Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay. So my presentation follows up quite nicely with Dr. Rai's, because what I'm trying to do in the presentation is look at at the existence of religion in the public sphere, but ask the question of how do Muslims enter into this public discourse? And this is something that increasingly Muslim academics have been talking about. And so what I want to do in the presentation is not flesh out necessarily how religion in general enters into the public sphere, but how Muslims can feel as if they can legitimately enter into the public sphere. Investigating the place of religion within the public sphere is acquiring new momentum as the academic dictum that religion has gone public is now accepted as commonplace. In his groundbreaking book, Public Religions, Jose Casanova aptly demonstrates that from the 1970s onwards, religion was no longer cloistered to the private sphere. Rethinking the secularization thesis as it is known, Casanova posits that there are three...
You didn't finish the 15 minutes.
Huh?
You didn't finish the 15 minutes. But there is pressure from the other side because of the tempo.
Oh, they want to slow it down.
Yeah, so, yeah,
okay,
yes.
all right.
And I will tolerate a couple of minutes extra because of this pressure also.
Okay. Fleshing out the secularization thesis, Casanova posits that there are three distinct elements to secularization. The first is the institutional differentiation resulting in the separation of the sacred from the state. The second is the decline of religion, or the idea that religion is on the decline, there's not that many religious believers anymore. And the third is the privatization of religion. Canvassing religious politics globally, Casanova argues that while institutional differentiation between the sacred and the state is still in effect, the other two elements of the secularization thesis no longer hold true. This argument is echoed by others who focus on the Muslim world and argue that religion was actually never fully taken out of politics after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, even in so-called secular states. This begs the fundamental question: when religion goes public, where exactly does it go in relation to what we are calling the public sphere? Through this talk, I will attempt to answer this fundamental question through four related investigations. First, I will begin with a broad understanding of the public sphere, and I might actually shorten that since that was done in the previous presentation quite well. Second, I will explore the arguments for religion in the public sphere. Then I will present the arguments of Dr. Sherman Jackson and Dr. Muhammad Fadl regarding Islam in the public sphere. And finally, I will end with my own critical reflections. The assumption is that when religion goes public, it appears in the public sphere, but we have to ask ourselves what exactly is the public sphere that we refer to. The academic discussion regarding the public sphere was initiated, as my colleague previously said, by Jürgen Habermas in his work, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere. In it, he aimed to provide a historical overview of the emergence, growth, and decline of what he calls the bourgeois public sphere. He argued that the public sphere emerged in the 18th century as a social space which was distinct from the state, economy, and family, where individuals could engage each other as private citizens deliberating about the common good. In this way, whereas the state continued to monopolize the ability to coerce its citizens, the public sphere became the realm of the unforced force of rational deliberation. The two key elements for Habermas's public sphere were the existence of this rational deliberation and an agreed-upon notion of what was the common good. Though Habermas's book was widely praised for its study of the public sphere, it neglected the role of religion. Habermas's assumption throughout the book was that the public sphere was in fact secular, and the rational deliberation that took place was along the lines of secular post-Enlightenment reasoning. But if Casanova and others are indeed correct that religion has gone public, then the public sphere of modern-day societies are actually post-secular pluralistic public spheres, in which deliberation and agreement upon the common good is not simply according to a secular logic. This raises the fundamental question of how religion enters into this space. The discourse on accommodating religious viewpoints into a conception of the common good and the public sphere was originally undertaken by liberal thinkers. Still? Okay. Was undertaken by liberal thinkers who saw societal plurality as posing both challenges and opportunities for secular liberal democracies. John Rawls, in his book Political Liberalism, most fundamentally seeks to understand how to create an overlapping consensus in liberal societies where there are competing comprehensive notions of the good. Rawls understands that in these pluralistic societies, not only are religions in the public sphere, but religions present doctrines of the comprehensive good that must be engaged in through rational deliberation. He calls this rational deliberation the idea of public reason, and argues that it is through public reason that pluralistic societies can arrive at a notion of the common good, and also engage in dialogue with religious groups and still maintain state neutrality towards religion. Rawls and other liberal thinkers thus accept that religion is now part of the public sphere, and religions can positively contribute to public discourse. However, this acceptance on the part of liberal thinkers raises a series of questions for religious believers, and this is what I want to focus on here. In the context of Islam, the question becomes, is there a notion of public reason that allows for Muslims to create an overlapping consensus in liberal societies? Doesn't public reasoning itself entail adopting a secular epistemic paradigm which necessarily contradicts a mode of reasoning adopted by individual believers? And can an articulation of the common public good ever actually be divorced from questions of Islamic law and theology if you are a believer? These are complex questions that are recently undertaken by a series of Islamic scholars in the Western intellectual academic tradition. Starting with Muhammad Fadl, in his article, The True, the Good, and the Reasonable, the Theological and Ethical Roots of Public Reason in Islamic Law, he argues that within Islam one can locate a notion of public reasoning that maps onto the type of public reasoning that is advocated for by Rawls. He starts with the basic assertion that in order to begin any inquiry into public reason, one must start with a discourse on Islamic theology, as legal and political commitments, according to him, within Islamic law are actually subordinate to and carry less moral weight within the normative tradition than do commitments in theology and ethics. Following forth from this basic assertion, Fadl presents three interrelated arguments for the notion of public reason within Islam. First, he argues that the Islamic tradition privileged rational inquiry and deliberation by focusing on the doctrine of wujub an-nadar, the idea that you have the individual is obligated to reason the existence of God. He notes that while most Ash'aris did not declare non-reflective belief invalid, this is the idea of iman al-muqallid, they did note that belief which is the result of nadar is more praiseworthy. This basic Ash'ari assertion that reasoning is an obligation, Fadl notes, is an indication of the positive place of rational inquiry. The second argument that Fadl makes is that while rational inquiry was considered praiseworthy, greater emphasis was placed on the procedural integrity of the inquiry over and above the substantive conclusions that were actually reached. This was especially apparent in the realm of law, where the methodology of each madhab was considered a legitimate source of norm generation. The result of emphasis on procedure over conclusions for Fadl was the rise of what he calls normative pluralism within Islamic law, and its concomitant doctrine of epistemological skepticism. In other words, through rational inquiry, it was also understood, though rational inquiry was understood within theology as being important, it was also understood that outside of theology, in the realm of law, it was equally important, and there could be multiple valid conclusions. The last argument made by Fadl is that the result of what he calls normative pluralism and the desire to have legal answers for a variety of questions not immediately addressed in revelatory sources, jurists were willing to to legitimize and recognize making arguments that were consistent with revelation but not necessarily based on revelation. This non-revelatory mode of reasoning, Fadl argues, is akin to public reasoning that Rawls argues for, as both are fundamentally concerned with the notion of good. When we take all three of these arguments together, Fadl seeks to establish the validity and primacy of rational inquiry within Islam. He seeks to also emphasize this notion of normative plurality, and also he wants to show that non-revelatory reasoning is also just as important as revelatory reasoning. Through establishing these three principles, the central aim for Fadl is to show that public reasoning within Islam actually exists, and the public reasoning within Islam can be applied to the type of liberal public reasoning that is advocated for by Rawls. Well, let me just skip over that part for a moment. In the end, Fadl seeks to open up a space in which Muslims can engage in the type of public reasoning that will create an overlapping consensus in pluralistic societies. In his argument, he purposefully leaves aside Islamic law, which is quite curious, noting that law is simply a handmaiden to theology. However, Sherman Jackson does the opposite and attempts to contend with the centrality of Islamic law within the Islamic tradition. Whereas the goal of Fadl's argument is to construct a realm of public reasoning within Islam on the basis of Islamic theology, Sherman Jackson seeks to construct the realm of the Islamic secular, unpenetrated by Islamic law, in which the individual can reason. Instead of thinking of the secular as antagonistic to religion, borrowing from Max Weber, Jackson describes the secular as a realm that is neither governed nor adjudicated through the concrete indicants of revelation or their extension as recognized within Islam. He thus makes the claim that the Islamic secular is not forced onto Islam from outside, but it emerges within Islam as the result of the Sharia's own voluntary self-imposed jurisdictional limits. Jackson notes that within Islamic thinking, there were two ways of describing the jurisdiction of the Sharia. In one vision, denoted as scriptural universalism, every action that the human being undertakes is understood to have a legal ruling attached to it. The job of the jurist is thus to assign human value to actions in everyday life. Though Jackson notes that this understanding of the Sharia was in fact dominant historically, he argues that other legal visions of the Sharia were present that circumscribed the realm in which the Sharia could actually function. He notes classical jurists such as Al-Ghazali, Al-Qarafi, and Ibn Taymiyyah, who all acknowledge that there are certain matters and certain rational sciences in which the Sharia does not penetrate. In these realms, individuals cannot rely upon the traditional scriptural sources of the Sharia or the typical tools of Islamic methodology, and therefore the realm of the non-Shari'i can be understood as the Islamic secular. The Sharia in this vision for Jackson is, and I quote, "the medium through which God's will is made known in concrete, objectively verifiable terms," end quote. But if and when the Sharia does not concretely address an issue, Sherman Jackson acknowledges the existence of all other modes of rational assessment that can lead one to perfectly valid conclusions. The secular for Jackson is thus not differentiated from religion, but from the Shari'i. To support his argument, Jackson, similar to Muhammad Fadl, returns to kalam, or to theology. And he argues that the intellect was always viewed as a judicious tool for rational inquiry, and it could function both before and after revelation to determine value judgments. Jackson's fear is that over-legislation, this idea of focusing on the Sharia too much, will result in individuals seeking legal rulings alone, ignoring other things that are important, and he mentions ethics quite specifically, that can be valuable to create an overlapping consensus within society. Aside from this, for Jackson, there are other benefits to opening up this realm of the Islamic secular. First, it safeguards governments from the pressures of Islamic legislation, which we know is obviously increasing. Second, it distributes the power of lawmaking and deliberation. And third, and most importantly, it enables Muslim individuals to deliberate in the public sphere to the extent that their public deliberations are within the framework of the Islamic secular. Though Fadl primarily relies on Islamic theology and Jackson on Islamic law, both are ultimately trying to establish the primacy of rational inquiry within the Islamic tradition to argue for a space in which Muslims can then come and engage in public reasoning in liberal societies legitimately. It is important to note that beyond an emphasis on rational inquiry, underlying both of their inquiries is a more circumscribed notion of the Sharia that understands it either as a handmaiden into theology with ethical and moral dictates of theology trumping specific laws, as articulated by Fadl, or as a realm of law that is only binding to the extent that it can provide concrete, objectively verifiable laws, as articulated by Sherman Jackson. In both of the arguments, the onus is placed on the Muslim community and the Muslim individual to articulate a way in which Muslims can emerge authentically and legitimately in the public sphere. While both articulations are indeed needed and merit-worthy, they overlook certain elements of the public sphere which must be problematized in order for religious discourse to actually be effective and accepted when it emerges. The two problematic elements I would like to focus on are the exclusionary nature of the public sphere connected to state power and the additional burden that both of these scholars are placing upon the religious citizen. Starting with the first, the exclusionary nature of the public sphere, though the public sphere was ideally conceptualized as a place distinct and free from the political, scholars have increasingly written about how modern governance does not leave any realm unregulated. Dalal Asad, in his Formations of the Secular, critiquing the modern state, writes, and I quote, "There is no space in which all citizens can negotiate freely and equally with one another," end quote. For Asad, modernity is a project that seeks to institutionalize certain principles, and one of these principles is secularism, and it is not just institutionalized formally through the state, but also in the public sphere. He notes that when the public sphere was originally created, it was, in fact, exclusionary. Men, women, minorities were all excluded. This exclusionary nature continues in the case of religions in the public sphere, where not all religions are allowed to enter, and even when certain religions are allowed to, they must conform to the modes of rational expression and persuasion acceptable to the project of the modern state. He thus states, and I quote, "The public sphere is a space necessarily, not just contingently, articulated by power," end quote. Asad's critique of modern power and the public sphere is meant to highlight that simply opening up a space for Muslims to think about public reasoning and Islam in the public sphere is simply not enough, as there are political, theological, and legal conditions placed upon Muslims and religious discourse when it enters. The second problem is that by requiring religious citizens to conform to a secular public reasoning, an additional onus is placed on religious citizens to articulate their reasoning in a secular way. This fundamentally returns to an epistemic privilege that is still awarded to secular liberal reasoning over religious reasoning. If religious citizens are truly endowed with equal rights, then the secular consciousness should be able to reflect on the limits of secular or post-metaphysical reasoning in the same way that it is expected of a religious citizen to accept the limitations of their religious reasoning. Moreover, if the consequences of the religious citizen adopting public reasoning devoid of their religious commitments creates a dichotomy between private religious forms of reasoning and public secular forms of reasoning. Not only does this again privilege a certain form of reasoning, but the social and political consequences of a dual rationality cannot be predicted. Few scholars would resist the assertion that religion has gone public. Thus, the challenge is not arguing for the public nature of religion, rather the challenge is conceptualizing how religion can appear in the public sphere that accounts for modern power and the continued unspoken privilege of secular reasoning.
Thank you very much, Suhaira. Most exemplary and also sticking to the time limit much, despite the...
شكرا جزيلا.
Sheikh Farouk Fariz, our third speaker, whose contribution today makes part of what we can call bid'ah hasana, a good bid'ah, which we start this time in our 6th international conference in CILE, involving students, not only from the Master of Islamic Ethics, but from the college in general, by involving students who are doing their master thesis on topics related to the themes of the conference. So in this session we have Farouk, the next session we will have Yusuf. So a special welcome to you, Farouk, to the conference and to this session. Thank you. You see, the audience is not neutral enough because he has his own fans also. Thank you. We'll speak about this later in the class, inshallah. Farouk got his BA honors in comparative religion and Usuluddin from the International Islamic University in Malaysia, and he's now doing his master degree in Islamic thought and applied ethics in the College of Islamic Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University. Besides his academic ventures, Farouk is also involved in community engagement programs in his home country, Singapore, like in the Singapore Islamic Scholars and Religious Teachers Association and the Religious Rehabilitation Group, and he's also a member of the CILE Alumni Network. You got a presentation about it by the beginning of this conference. With great pleasure, I give the floor to Farouk, and you have 15 minutes, Farouk. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Ghali, for the introduction, and thank you to Kyle and the organizers for trusting me with this huge responsibility. First, I have to make a disclaimer that I'm not a sheikh, even though my name is Sheikh Farouk Fariz. But I feel so small and honored to be part of this, or to sit among great scholars, and I hope to do justice. To start with, this topic is part of my thesis, and I hope to summarize it within 15 minutes, so please be patient with me, and inshallah, I'll try my best. So one of the huge challenges for those who want to work on the question of HIV/AIDS in Islam and with Muslims living with the disease is the attempt to position within the mainstream Muslim community. This is because we are not only dealing with a particular community, but what is more crucial and important is we are dealing with our own text. There are certain answers in the text that we believe in and we cannot run away from it, but there are other social elements that we clearly witness and have a moral obligation to speak. Take, for example, a story between a scholar and an activist. The Quran says, take good care of your parents. But in reality, we find that, the activist, she found that Muslims are abandoning their parents when they get old. Therefore, the activist started an old age home for these abandoned parents. The scholar admonished her and said that this is against Islam, as she is normalizing or encouraging people to abandon their parents. And the activist responded to the scholar, you have been preaching people not to abandon their parents, but for the moment, I, as a social worker, sit with the reality of people being thrown off the streets. Well, this incident tells us the conflict between the ideal and reality requires our ethics to respond to the issue at hand. The ongoing story of abstinence is an important narrative, but at some point, somebody else has to deal with the fact that the story is not reaching. Moral narratives, in some ways or many, has the answer, but it is not everything. As Muslims, when our local moral world are being tested and challenged, we find conflicting religious proclivities that aim at exalting the values of Islam to be the ultimate frame of reference. That being said, there is no disease till now that lends itself to such tension like HIV/AIDS. This is because its complexity lies in one of its primary modes of transmission, namely sexual contact, which touches very sensitive social and ethical dimensions, such as stigmatization, poverty, and gender-based violence. A study of the available literature on Islam and HIV/AIDS acquaints us with two main approaches that I have personally categorized in dealing with the pandemic. The first approach regards HIV/AIDS solely as a lifestyle disease and blame it on immoral sexual lifestyle for the spread of the pandemic. It further holds that HIV/AIDS is a sign of divine wrath and see a return to Islam as a solution to prevent Muslims from catching the disease. This approach is also known as the moralist position, and it was first pioneered by the prominent Muslim psychologist Malik Badri, which he addressed in his seminal work, The AIDS Crisis. Advocates of this position suggest an Islamically oriented prevention model that can not only prevent the spread of the pandemic, but to galvanize Muslims to break the chains of mental slavery from Western secular values and forego apologetic defensiveness. However, this was met with fierce resistance by the other camp that argues against the efficacy of an Islamic prevention model as an idealized, one-size-fits-all solution. Being a Muslim, they argue, is not sufficient security against HIV/AIDS. Advocates of this position suggest the need to re-examine the social relevance of Islam that takes into account the psychological state of the victims and develops strategies to humanize those on the edge of society, or people whom they call mustada'afuna fil ard. This position is also known as the liberationist approach, and that is strongly advocated by the South African Muslim scholar Farid Ishaq. Well, I argue that the contention between these two approaches is due to different epistemological frameworks. An analysis of both, moving on to the analysis of both positions, the moralists would explicitly subscribe to Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, an Islam versus West narrative, us against them, and further acknowledges a perpetual clash of civilizational values that cannot be reconciled, for example, the Western concept of family institution. In addition, the inclination to promote a civilizational bifurcation to identify one against the other has to do more with one's personal aspirations rather than a true account of the other. For example, when attempting to explain or delineate an account of what represents the West, there is a tendency to construct an image that reflects presumed anxieties and aspirations, for example, human rights. Now, this is the very reason why people from this approach categorically rejected a Western prevention model. I argue that this tendency is socially constructed due to a particular historical and political experience like colonialism and Western modernity. By creating a prevention strategy where a return to Islam is imperative and entails demonizing the West, I argue that it does not fully address the problem. Although there is merit in these claims, like how racist some narratives on HIV/AIDS are, and the implications of the sexual revolution during the 1960s and social media, the booming of social media, it fails to address equally important factors that aggravated the pandemic, like gender inequality, where women in many patriarchal societies are put at risk. According to UNAIDS, 1 in 3 women worldwide has experienced physical and sexual violence by an intimate partner or non-partner in her life. In addition, lack of access to education impedes agency of women to be empowered in decision-making to mitigate the impact of gender-based violence. Moreover, if an Islamic prevention model is the solution, how then can we explain the success rate in countries like Botswana, Cambodia, Iceland, and even Singapore that have managed to contain the epidemic without subscribing to an Islamic prevention model? It is based on this inconsistency that the liberationist camp emerged to question the efficacy of moralizing the issue and highlight the importance of social justice in the fight against HIV/AIDS. Now, to understand a liberationist approach, let me share with you a narrative and reflect on it. One day there is a woman who stands at the bottom of a river, and a baby comes down the river. She catches the baby and looks after the baby. After a few days, she went to the river again. She found another baby. She took care of the baby, and the next day she found another one. Well, the liberationist approach would say, take a pause. The prophetic task is to possibly go up there and confront the one who is throwing these babies down. Now, the process of going up there is not just an expression of compassion and mercy. It is an expression of activism. It is in this light that I argue the liberationist approach represents a dialectical relationship between theology and praxis. Advocates of this theory suggest an idea of a theology of compassion that is largely based on liberation ideals such as compassion, responsibility, and justice. This is because people living with HIV are regarded, as explained earlier, mustada'afun, individuals that are subjugated to tyrannical structures that have led to socioeconomic inequalities. Therefore, the onus is on us to show concern, compassion, and struggle to confront the injustices that are affecting the lives of people living with HIV. However, what I find problematic is the hermeneutics applied to formulate this theology of compassion, which I arguably see it as a grassroots practical application of a progressive Muslim enterprise that gives priority to orthopraxis over orthodoxy. The progressive epistemology openly draws from sources outside the Islamic tradition, such as Christian liberation theology, as well as liberal leftist ideas from Chomsky, for example, that attempt to synthesize a Quranic imperative to serve as witness for God and justice and to speak truth to the power. As much as it is important, the approach implies an iconoclastic reformation of the tradition. In short, there is a deep methodological issue in which the limits and scope of reform are unclear, and that arguably opens a postmodern Pandora's box, such as the rereading of the story of Prophet Lut alayhi salam to accommodate same-sex relations. The dislocation of the tradition to pursue socio-political ideals can fall short of its stated objectives by essentializing the text, compounded by numerous conceptual contradictions. In conclusion, the epistemological difference between the moralists and liberationists is evident in their approach towards HIV/AIDS, as it is defined by how they see Islam. In the broader sense, these approaches have dominated deliberations on HIV/AIDS in Muslim public sphere. I would suggest reading my beloved supervisor, Dr. Ghali's article on HIV/AIDS to sort of understand the significance of Badri and Ishaq's works in shaping collective religio-scientific discussions on Islam and HIV/AIDS in fiqh council such as IOMS, and to see or understand the contention between Muslim scholars and biomedical scientists that is attributed both explicitly and implicitly to the ideas of Badri and Ishaq, mainly on Islamic versus human rights discourse. It also explains how this contention sort of affected the drafting of certain religious rulings, such as the validity of marriage between spouses, and also whether to allow people living with HIV to travel for Hajj. Nevertheless, in my thesis, I argue the need for a cross-epistemic dialogue between both approaches to establish an equilibrium between both factions through the lens of human dignity. This can be done through a constructive engagement between Islamic and human rights tradition that can potentially lead to future collaboration and internal renewal of both traditions to remain relevant, while at the same time recognizing specific discursive constraints and make it a living tradition. A dynamic and flexible language shared by both traditions can be established to build a moral and just society. Unfortunately, it is not within the scope of the discussion to continue this, as I'm still working on it. It's part of my thesis. So your comments and prayers are very much appreciated, and thank you.
The records, the shortest talk so far.
That's a compliment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I move now to Dr. Mu'taz Al-Khatib from our center, the one who is responsible for methodology and ethics in CILE. Dr. Mu'taz, he got his PhD on Hadith textual criticism, and his book is published on this topic. He is a founding member of Al-Multaqa Al-Fikri, Al-Ibda' Intellectual Forum for Innovation. He was, of course, known for many people as the anchor of Al-Sharia and Al-Haya program on Al Jazeera, and the editor-in-chief of Islam and Contemporary Issues at Islam Online. Dr. Mu'taz Al-Khatib was a visiting fellow at ZMO in Berlin, and visiting scholar at in Berlin also, again 2006 and then 2012. He lectured at many universities around the world, in the US and in Europe. He has an impressive list of publications both in Arabic and English. So it's my great pleasure to introduce him and to give him the word, with just a very quick footnote, a very quick note about his title. His title in Arabic, Al-Ma'rifa As-Sa'ila. As-Sa'ila, of course, in Arabic can be fluid and can be questioning. And the translation was, took the second, but it is the first. It is about the fluid knowledge, not about the inquisitive, maybe also about the inquisitive implicitly, but it's about the fluidity of knowledge in our age. So this is just a note for our translators when he uses the term السائلة. Thank you very much, and Dr. Mu'taz, you have 15 minutes.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور محمد غالي على التقديم. سأتحدث بالعربية فيما يخص مداخلتي تحديدا.
I will be speaking in Arabic. So here we are speaking about inquisitive knowledge, public sphere, and the end of tradition. Tradition, not imitation. So I will tackle three concepts. The first one is about liquidity or fluidity. The second one is this public sphere and tradition. In 2008, I dedicated a whole episode of Sharia al-Haya, which is to tackle fluidity in knowledge. At that time, I didn't know Bauman, but I used this before knowing Bauman and before it was translated into Arabic. But here, I am compelled to speak about Bauman and the understanding I am about to explore on. So he has written on this issue extensively, and here we are speaking about the dealing of Bauman modernity that's fluid to post-modernity, or what was commonly known as post-modernity. He calls it fluid modernity. So he speaks about modernity that has transformed the Enlightenment human being from the rigidity of ration to be adaptive to the reality as is. So Bauman here sees that fluidity means the decline of the good public or public good and the trumping of personal agendas. So, in his criticism of Western modernity, change is the only constant for Bauman, and the only certain is the uncertain. That is, we don't know where we are headed. So the reflection trumps, or authority trumps policy. So policy goes toward a given goal. But the fluidity here, I found it explained by Shatibi. Imam Shatibi, I used that in my latest book. He says that anyone who looks at the ways of those who commit innovation in religion, he would see that they are limitless. And he speaks here about the interpretation of why scholars controlled the approaches of the scholars, but not controlling the approaches of those who commit innovation in religion, because those approaches are fluid and no law controls them. The second concept is the public sphere. To clarify what sphere I speak about, the concept of Habermas was limited to a political intellect, and it was linked to the modern state understanding, and it is a result of modern political thought. So it's based on two fundamentals: separating philosophy and theology, and separating public from private, secularism that is. But that's not what I'm talking about. Not in the Habermas understanding, but rather I'm speaking about public sphere in terms of epistemology. And public here has three relevant points. The first one is the common sphere where people gather. The second is the open space, easily accessible by all. The third one is the concept of public opinion formed in this public sphere, which is a common view where all individuals penetrate and reach a common conviction. But the liquidity or fluidity that I speak about here, in terms of what is general, there's a contradiction. Meaning, how do we speak about what is general in public? And here I'm speaking about liquidity or fluidity. Fluidity has individual views, and fluidity has no limits. So general is different from fluidity or liquidity. Fluidity is against tradition. So we cannot speak about individual and tradition at the same time. So I use public sphere outside the Habermas concept, and I use it in epistemology, not in policy. And I use it outside the public view or common stance, which is formed in the Habermas sphere. So here we are speaking about an uncontrolled public sphere which is difficult to control. And among its attributes is the democratization of knowledge and also the freedom of access to the sources by all, and the formation of a critical inclination that's individual. And thus I will move to tradition so that the link is clarified. When I use tradition, here we are speaking about epistemology in receiving and producing knowledge, which is organized, disciplined, generation after another, through an ongoing interaction between text and reality, through the intellectual specialized elite. This tradition was based on different Islamic concepts throughout history in Islam. Among the main concepts is that each scholar, you cannot find him a scholar in biographies and books who doesn't have his own sheikhs and his own disciples. So it's an ongoing link through history. Each scholar or each jurist will have his own teachers or sheikhs and students or disciples, talamid. This is in the system of receiving knowledge. The second concept is the congregation or the public who had nothing to do with the prior of the establishment of the state. I have 4 cases here, or 4 different spheres to talk about. Imam al-Juwayni says, public have no say in choosing the imam. That is, people or like women and slaves. In the political spheres, public have no opinion to choose the imam or the leader or the political power. In Kalam or discourse, we all know the book of Abi Hamid al-Ghazali, Al-Jam al-Awam an Ilm al-Kalam. In legislations, we know Imam al-Shatibi spoke about the public meaning and the private meaning. The public is well known by all people, so it is common by all people who have an understanding that's less. So Ibn Rushd in philosophy says the public is unable to understand the evidence or the proof. Why? Because proof or burhan needs intellectual elite. So there are 4 concepts here: philosophy, legislation, political, and kalam or discourse. So the public has limited authority, limited access to those scientific and epistemological and knowledge issues, and has no power to choose the leader, because knowledge was divided into theoretical and practical. So the practical is by giving examples so that it will be understood easily. Today, knowledge is disseminated and the public has tools through reading and writing, and then illiteracy came to turn from illiteracy into modern illiteracy. In the origin, we were speaking about reading and writing, and now knowing the technologies. And then social media came about, which has liquidated knowledge and done away with borders. So the capital of the blogger now, who publishes his views in any sphere of science, is just to have a computer and Wi-Fi, and to write whatever he wants in science, physics, chemistry, religion, sociology, politics, and everything. The understanding of the public also has changed within this context, and the classical era has changed. The public nowadays has an ability to understand in terms of owning those tools and to philosophize things and prove things, and they do not accept anything except with justification. And also the individualism idea has become prevalent to this public. So this transformation has also reached the knowledge and its producers. So now we have new players in knowledge and epistemology. Individualism has become widespread. Everyone produces knowledge, irrespective of his skills and qualifications. Especially in the Arab world, there are no copyrights. You can publish any book and theories that you like, left and right. This has expanded since the 90s. In the 90s, we have seen cultural educational projects and religious reform tackled by people outside the realm of Islamic knowledge, such as Nasser Abu Zaid and Muhammad Shahrur. In the other context, in the 90s also, we have seen the internet and expansion on Islamic websites, which has become prevalent. Also satellite channels which produce preachers and religious discourse and muftis from outside the religious realm of education even. So the public now has this great amount of information, yet he is unable to understand the epistemological and traditions of knowledge, because this needs time and rhythm now, which is rather speed and quickness and hurrying, needs specialization. So the time and the specialization is not available to those. Also, the public is able to get access to different interpretation and not really choose among them. So now they have personal individual discretions and ones that are likely to be loved and liked, and also according to standards portrayed by the media and the authorities in order to be a thesis worthy of acceptance. And we have seen also the decline of what is agreed upon in the public sphere. Thus, traditional or religious or scientific traditions are absent. In the past, it was controlled by mechanisms such as receiving knowledge and the licensing system and the mechanism of consensus about things about religion, where the elite is combining itself with the public, and also the sequencing in order to reach certain knowledge, and the mechanism of what is being decreed upon religiously, where the elite is in agreement, and also what is normative, which is the science that is settled socially in the public's mind. So now we had a system of epistemological interpretive system. On the other side of this, we have seen aberration of interpretation. Facing that, and maybe because of this liquidity or fluidity, we see the rise of new traditionalism in the European context. Among its scholars have been gained on in the 20s, and he influenced many of them, such as Abdul Hakim Murad. That's why this new traditionalism wants to restore tradition against Western modernity and within modernity, but illiteracy and expansion of knowledge through the print press since the end of the 19th century and through the internet and its tools that didn't contribute to developing knowledge and epistemological knowledge, but rather in making it superficial and fragmenting it. But why? Mankind has transformed from organized and disciplined knowledge and epistemology into producing what he thinks is knowledge and creating their own theories in religion and different disciplines such as alternative medicine, and even some people in the US now deny that the earth is spherical and they want to go to space to prove that the earth is flat and not spherical. This is not confined to religious knowledge, but rather it has encompassed other disciplines and it has trickled down to other types of knowledge. So what are the consequences of this fluidity or liquidity to specialized knowledge or science? Is a problem also in the religious discourse or in the nature of the era, which is fluid? And this is the spirit of the world that has become prevalent. These are big questions, and I cannot answer them, but I'm just giving them as food for thought. But to conclude, I say that this takes us to an idea of interactive or overlapping history, which combines different eras at the same time and even at the same place. Today we can speak about different societies, multiple societies in one country, in the social media, and there are parallel societies similar to it, traditional, and Malik bin Nabi, some read Malik bin Nabi, some read Bauman, some read Talal al-Asad, etc. So here we are not speaking about one society, but rather different overlapping societies at the same time, congruently, and in the same country. And I conclude with that. All praises due to Allah.
May God reward you. We'll open the floor now for questions and answers.
We'll have another session. We are a bit late. So I do hope from those who want to interfere to be to the point, raise this question as short as possible so that we can finish on time and don't take from the time of the following session. We have something like half an hour. So I will open now the floor for questions and answers, and I will also ask the speakers to be as concise as possible for their answers. Who wants to speak? Dr. Nuruddin.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ملحوظة سريعة ثم
Of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, a comment and then a question to Dr. Mu'taz. As a specialist in communication, I do understand that if the sociological meaning of fluidity is paramount to chaos, especially when it comes to the prevalence of social media networks and then the knowledge pockets and the overlapping societies, so on and so forth, as well as issuing fatwas by some, we might understand this within the ambit of the new technological revolution. However, what I did not understand is the following. How could the technological revolution that took place perhaps 3 decades ago and the internet thereby, how such a revolution that the publishing houses and the governmental departments, activists, and so on and so forth derive benefit from. How could such technology made our minds superficial? If we look at any educational institution or a publishing house, for example, their revenues would pour into the democratization of the knowledge itself. Perhaps I contradict your idea in this part. To my knowledge, we might live in a chaotic kind of era when it comes to the social media, because there are plenty of sources and there are plenty of dubious sources that we might indeed think twice of using them. However, there is also a platform whereby sources have been democratized. If you look at the minorities in the world, indeed, the minorities reflected themselves through the virtual reality. And what about the e-books and the e-journals? The publishing houses played a major role in this industry. Indeed, it used to be a monopoly. However, it is different nowadays. When you want to have a research in place, you can go to the library in your university. It is a lot easier than what is used to be. Indeed, if you just Google a certain word, especially when it comes to the Islamic heritage sources, you can indeed read them on a PDF file. I used to read books at the high school, but now they are available electronically.
هذا يعني الجانب ربما السلبي مما يحدث في.
So this is my question. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور نور الدين. Any other questions? أي أسئلة أخرى؟ أستاذ هشام.
أول سؤالي سيكون.
My question is directed to Dr. Suhair. Suhaira, it is Suhaira, it is not Suhair. There is, yes, regardless of the meaning of the name, yes, it is Suhaira, it is not Suhair. The gentleman is saying that there is a word, there's a letter that is being added, ta. And the gentleman is saying, no, it is Suhaira. So, here, when we talk about the dogmatic mind and the critical mind and the leap thereof, when it comes to Islam, the critical mind is expansive. Here we talk about theological and otherwise political, and every single study following such thesis used to have a principled kind of crystal clear methodology, and it is threefold: description, assessment, and judgment. Mostly the judgment or the assessment would emanate from within, and criticism would be leveled at each other when it comes to not abiding by such methodology. My question is methodological. I'm in an academy here, and we want just to develop such criticism in order not for us to deviate from the right path. What are the mechanisms and the methodologies of the reason-related Islamic criticism away from demagogical kind of mind? My other question is, Dr. Mu'taz, the ABC of logics in accordance with the scale of Al-Akhdari and others to understand the lexicon and the percentage thereby of the lexicon in accordance with the sentence. So when it comes to such efforts, I think we do face a problem. What is the opinion of Dr. Mu'taz in the rigidity of most of the Sharia specialists who make efforts when it comes to the tradition per se, despite the fact that they lean sometimes to an old heritage and lean towards certain translations or interpretations of what goes on in the West. Thank you. Any further questions?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, all blessings are due to our Prophet Muhammad. I would like to thank CILE for organizing this conference. I'd like to thank the speakers, the panelists, and the chair of this session. My question is addressed to Dr. Mu'taz. As far as the fluidity is concerned, do you think that the quoted text that is interpreted in a number of modern issues and the confused and understanding vis-a-vis certain contentious issues, and being contentious is not an innovative thing. However, being adamant at being contentious is the issue here. So you have talked about the fluidity of the ideas and the parameters of knowledge. What's the standard that might we follow in order to epistemologically stave ourselves off such confusion, in order for us to be real and to follow the reality that is acceptable by all? Thank you.
Yes, please.
شكرا للدكتور معتز وفات علينا أن نشكر.
I'd like to thank Dr. Mu'taz, and I'd like to thank also the master of ceremony, or rather the chair of this session. My question is as follows. What are the determinants or the parameters that we might resort to in order to understand the fluidity itself? And would it be possible to have a similar word from the Sharia texts? I would like also to thank the gentleman for his intervention.
أسئلة أخرى? Other questions? تفضل.
So Professor Siddiqui, she mentioned that Rawls had the concept of the common good, and I'm aware that Zygmunt Bauman also spoke about happiness and the concept of good, as well as we have the concept of ma'ruf that Dr. Mu'taz spoke about. So I was wondering, what is the concept of common good is there a specific concept from an Islamic perspective, and how does that come into fruition? Thank you.
Other questions? Everybody satisfied? Okay. So now I give the floor to the four of you. Everyone would have like 5-7 minutes, if you like, to comment on the questions, even if they are not directed to you. You will have the freedom. And I will keep Dr. Mu'taz at the end, or you would like to start to cover because you received most of the questions. No, you can start, because otherwise I will silence you at the end and you will get angry. So yes, you can start. You can start. Yes.
Okay. Bismillah
In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, as far as the first point is concerned, we are talking about the public sphere. But the doctor is talking about these means from a different concept and from a different context. Indeed, it provided great benefits within the scholarship. However, we are talking about this issue outside the vicinity of the scholarship domain. And this is what I meant by fluidity, but not within the scholarship domain. And this is out of our discussion. And here I'm talking about the Arab context that is loose. It is not disciplined. So politically speaking, we cannot interfere or participate in the public sphere. We can participate in the epistemological kind of public sphere because there are no punishments. Anybody who has a theory in interpreting the Quran and so on and so forth, they can do so. Since the demise of Hawking, you can see what took place on the internet, and the fatwa or the decrees or the opinions in chemistry, in cosmology and in physics on a part of lay persons, and this is very surprising. And also the assessment of his work, whether his work is important or not important. So it is chaotic, and that's why I'm talking about, especially when we witness that in most of the Arab universities there are no strictly rigid, disciplined criteria that we follow, especially when it comes to publishing. How many peer-reviewed publishing houses in the Arab world we have? Very few. I'm not talking about Europe here and the West. The other issue, when it comes to the reason of the scholars being rigid when it comes to using certain lexicons, is it a question? Sorry, we cannot hear the gentleman. He's not using the microphone. Yes, here I'm talking about the way we receive knowledge. Yes, there is a problem. I think tradition has been depleted in a way. I mean, not resorting to the old books. No, we used to have a continuity in the process of the tradition. Every single scholar used to answer the questions with disciples and so on and so forth. But this has been disconnected. The other issue is the following: the produce of the academic institutions in the Arab context is poor when it comes to qualifications. So we cannot answer the questions of the contemporary world, and we cannot continue with our traditions. So here comes the fluidity. When people came from outside the traditional Islamic authority or scholarship, yes, they had certain fans. Shah has been translated just a month ago. It's been there for 50 years, and I think the Western Academy has indeed put Shaht behind them. Who will read Shaht in Arabic, not knowing what or who came before him or who came after him? So here we reinvent the same problems through the translation, and the translation is a double-edged sword, because you import certain problems that are sometimes far away from your context. The other question is to do with the concept and the parameters of the fluidity. Indeed, the disbelief in the comprehensivity or the prevalence of the definition itself. I don't like definitions because they are elastic, so I don't take heed of definitions that are absolute and all incorporating. And here I talk about concepts, and delving into concepts is very prickly and convoluted, and that's why we need to deal with concepts rather than definitions. When it comes to the public good, there was a question indeed about the public good. Yes, the common good. What was the question? Yeah, this relates to the following concept. The idea of the public sphere entailed the overlap of the tradition with modernity. And we had witnessed a number of patterns within the same community, intellectually wise and practically wise. And this had led to the lack of cleaving to the concept of ma'ruf or kindness, because the concept of ma'ruf used to be coherent intrinsically, but nowadays it is being obstructed because there are modern tools that manufacture the ma'ruf, or rather what is known rather than kind. Yes, ma'ruf means in this context what is known, common knowledge. So nowadays it is difficult to pinpoint the concept of the common knowledge because of such overlapping concepts. So what's common today cannot be pinpointed on the level of the family, on the level of the community, on the level of the same community. It is not entrenched in accordance with the social concepts, because everything is prone to discussion because of the globalization. What takes place in Egypt can be indeed can prevail in Syria, and so on and so forth. As they say, if America sneezes, then everybody will catch flu. Any country sneezes, everybody will catch flu. So this is the issue here. Thank you. Microphone, please. Here, we are talking about the concept of culture rather than the definition of culture. Could you ask the gentleman to use the microphone, please? We cannot hear him.
جيد 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 أخي الكريم. عموما إحنا يعني
As a matter of fact, we don't have to reach unanimous kind of agreement or consensus. You wanted to comment on the issue of culture very briefly, please. Yes, the definition, the absolute, the comprehensive definition has been dissipating. We need to look for concepts rather than definitions. But this doesn't mean that there are no links between concepts and the semantics of the lexicons or the technical terms. Yes, we do have technical terms, and we do have meanings of certain words, but the absolute definitions that we used to study at the Sharia departments or schools cannot lead us to a concept nowadays. We need to focus on the concept. So the concept of culture is different than the concept of knowledge or epistemology. The culture has different meanings when it comes to sociology or anthropology. The word culture has no equivalent in Arabic concept-wise, because ثقف وثقف, these are two verbs in Arabic that reflect the word culture. To be cultured or to culture and so on and so forth are different. But the concept of culture is a European concept. It is not an Arab is not an Arabic one. That's why there is a lifestyle that is different and there are different concepts of culture. That's why I say there are no definitions, but there are concepts. I wanted to find a definition for modernity, but the Sarkozy defined modernity as being renovation or revival. So if there is a room for definition, why not?
Thank you.
Yeah, on the question of so I would say the Islamic tradition entirely is based on critical thinking. My argument was not that critical thinking in Islam has to be introduced or that it's something that doesn't exist. But I think if you look at all of the disciplines, whether it be usul al-fiqh, kalam, mantiq, jadal, all of these different things, all exemplify the fact that critical thinking exists within the Islamic tradition. I think the important thing is understanding the Islamic tradition in its entirety and then engaging with other traditions. One of the things that Sherman Jackson and Muhammad Fadil were trying to do, they were not trying to say that critical thinking doesn't exist in the Islamic tradition. They were trying to say, how does the understanding of critical thinking, which is inside of the Islamic tradition, how does that help us engage with other traditions in secular societies or in liberal societies? So we're not, their argument is not we engage with them on the basis of their logic, but our internal tradition gives us the tools through which we engage with them.
You want to add any other thing on any topics? Okay. Dr. Basim?
When it comes to the concept or the theme of modernity or modernism, it wasn't to do with dispensing with the tradition. In the West, they did not elbow aside the tradition. Perhaps they let go with the dogmatic part of the tradition. However, the practical part was reserved or preserved. When it comes to justice, people say that it is a produce of modernism. However, when we look at the concept of justice, they resorted to Plato and they resorted to Thomas the Aquinian and they also resorted to Aristotle and they preserved the practical part of the concept of modernism. So there is a difference between the definition and the concept as follows. A concept includes the theoretical and the practical parts, whereby they can have determinants and they can have certain elements that they might resort to become practical. So I cannot talk about justice if I have no clear definition for the term itself, but the definition is valuable if it has been transformed or if it is transformed into practices. Otherwise, it will be dissipating. Actually, I'm not expert at the Sharia and the Islamic thought. However, I might say that we have a problem in the Arab world. We do follow self-flogging procedures at all time, and this does not lead us anywhere. The West self-flogged some of, indeed, parts of the civilization, and they preserved some. Modernity came out of tradition, and then the tradition itself was redefined in the modern era. We need perhaps to emulate the West at some stages, and we need perhaps to follow suit because they boycotted tradition, but not totally. That's why I said at the beginning they dispensed with the cosmetics of the religion. However, the essence of the religion was still there. In the West now, there is a recovery of religion, and indeed, in the Arab world, we need to derive lessons from this past. But I need first and foremost to confess and admit, to say that certain issues ought to come from the West. I cannot have a quantum leap in Islam, not taking into consideration what Muhammad Arkoun, Nasser Muhammad Abu Zayd, or others have provided to us, whether they sang from a different hymn sheet, or whether they were establishmenters, if I might say, or otherwise. I need to follow in the steps of these people in order to understand. And I'm from Lebanon, and I usually criticize the Lebanese, saying that we have been influenced by the French secularism, and Mu'taz from Syria, and we were under the influence of this school of thought. However, there are different schools of thought. This German school of thoughts did not follow a boycotting kind of elements. They did not boycott the past. They merged tradition with modernity, and thus Germany is a different country than France nowadays, and thus we need to follow certain examples as Arabs and Muslims in order to better our societies and to develop our religious sciences in accordance with the ambitions of the Arabs and Muslims. Thank you. Farouk, would you like to say anything?
See? Okay. I hereby conclude.
Oh,
Much. Please join me thanking for speakers. Thank you very much, and thank you so much for your contribution and your questions. And at 3:30 we come back for the second session. And now I give the floor to Rawan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ghali. Okay, we'll stop now for a break, and we'll come back at 3:30 inshallah, as Dr. Ghali said. Thank you very much.